In the early months of 1942, Japanese forces in the Pacific had all the momentum, steadily extending their defenses east of the home islands. But in the spring, the Americans exposed a gap in those defenses when Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle led a bombing raid over Tokyo. Strategically, it did very little, but the Doolittle raid was deeply unsettling for the Japanese. The Americans demonstrated how easily their bombers could reach mainland Japan, a serious threat that Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto resolved to eliminate by crushing the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto wanted to strike before the American war machine fully mobilized. Initially, he had hopes for another attack on Pearl Harbor, but defenses there were significantly stronger than they were on December 7, 1941. So instead, Yamamoto settled on a tiny atoll, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, a place called Midway. Yamamoto was confident the Americans would spare little to defend Midway, given its proximity to Pearl Harbor. He'd lure them out, then hit them in an all-out naval battle. The Japanese plan hinged on deception, diversionary tactics to maintain the element of surprise. But weeks before the attack, Allied codebreakers picked up on the impending assault, deciphering the date and the location. There would be no element of surprise for the Japanese. Instead, it would go to the Americans. Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester W. Nimitz deployed all available U.S. carriers into position around Midway. It was a force Yamamoto had grossly underestimated. But unaware the Americans were ready and waiting, the Japanese fleet stormed ahead, prepared to deliver their decisive blow. Early on June 4th, 1942, Japanese torpedo and dive bombers swooped in and began bombing Midway. The Americans launched a wave of counterattacks to intercept, and fierce fighting erupted over the Pacific. Taken by surprise, it wasn't long before the Japanese lost any illusions of a grand victory. By the end of the day, U.S. fighters and bombers had destroyed all 4 of Japan's carriers. The next day, the onslaught continued. The Japanese were pushed further west, making futile, sporadic attempts, eventually sinking one U.S. carrier, the USS Yorktown. But on June 7, 1942, it was overwhelmingly clear. The Americans were victorious.
The toll, 18 Japanese ships, cruisers, carriers, and destroyers, crippled like this or sent to the bottom. A blow more than equal to the defeat Japan suffered in the Battle of the Coral Sea.
The Battle of Midway was the beginning of a 3-year American offensive, unrelenting might that quickly turned the tide. The sleeping giant was now wide awake.